Meeting is now streaming live. Got it.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think that we will make a start. Thank you all very much for joining us today. And we have a terrific lineup of speakers today for you. And of course, we're going to be looking at a country I would suggest that hasn't been given enough attention, perhaps in our own media. And so it's a great chance to tap into our speakers' expertise and brilliance, try to unpick what has happened in Lebanon in recent years, and of course where this is all going. There's so much to discuss: the state of the political system. President Michel Aoun is due to leave office at the end of this month. There's the role of Hezbollah, of course, and the economic crisis that has hit Lebanon so hard, something that was so tragically highlighted by yet another boat disaster just over a week ago. The sheer desperation of all those who take risks with their lives. We've had, of course, still the ongoing impact of the Syria war, the refugee crises, and indeed, more recently, of course, it's a subject in the news today, the possibility of a gas deal with Israel and all that will entail. So I'm sure these are just some of the things that we'll be discussing today. And we have two great speakers. Zeina Khodr, who will start off. She's worked for Al Jazeera English since it launched. And she's covered and worked in many countries and regions, and has in particularly after the Arab Spring, done a lot of work, award-winning work on coverage in Syria, Iraq, Libya, as well as Lebanon. And also joining her, we're really delighted to have Maha Yahya, the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center, where she focuses broadly on political violence, identity politics, inequality, citizenship, and the refugee crisis, and one of the sharper, brighter observers of the Lebanese political scene. So without further ado, we're going to start, and we'll have brief comments from the two speakers, and we'll be able to open it up as ever in the chat for questions only, please. And hopefully we'll have a very fruitful debate. Zeina, you're a frontline journalist. You have to explain what is going on in Lebanon to your listeners, to your viewers. How do you see things at the moment?
The country is collapsing. This is not the Lebanon we've known. There's signs of collapse everywhere. Drive in the street, there's no traffic light. In a tunnel, you have to drive in dark tunnels, sometimes over a kilometer long. When I traveled to Doha a few months ago, my 5-year-old said, "Oh, Mom, look, there are lights in the tunnel." No electricity. The state cannot afford to buy fuel. If there's no electricity, then you can't pump water. So you face water shortages at home. If you have the money to afford a private generator, then you have electricity at home. And it's expensive. It's expensive to buy fuel. It's expensive to buy diesel. And like you mentioned, that boat tragedy, it wasn't the first, and it's unlikely to be the last. Maybe on that boat, the majority were Syrians and Palestinian refugees, but as of late, the numbers of Lebanese attempting the journey to try to reach Europe is increasing. The boat that capsized earlier this year in April, the majority on board were Lebanese. And we spent 3 or 4 days covering this story. And whoever we spoke to, whether it was a Lebanese, a Palestinian, a Syrian, they would tell us, if there's a boat right now, we'll get on it despite the risks. We can no longer cope with the situation. And most of the people live in the impoverished north, which was already very poor even before the latest economic crisis. People's salaries are worthless because of the currency devaluation. Now, you'd wonder, how is many people have asked me, how are people surviving? Well, a lot of Lebanese, there are a lot of expats. People have at least a family member abroad who sends that $100 or that $200 that make somehow some sort of a difference, but people are struggling. Just a week or so ago, we saw these bank holdups, a series of incidents where angry and desperate depositors used arms, whether real or toy guns, to access their savings, which were trapped in banks. And these people are not thugs. I sat with Bassam al-Sheikh he was the one who held up the bank in August, the federal bank, just 10 days ago. And this man was, he told me, I never held a gun. I never wanted to do this, but I was so desperate because my father is ill. I have to be able to buy medicine. I can't feel helpless when I have $200,000 in the bank. So, and these people have a lot of, they got a lot of public sympathy because so many others are like him. People were living off their savings in this country. Unemployment is high. So the situation is dire, and there's a breakdown of state services, but all the while you have a political class which has really been blamed for mismanagement and corruption for decades that led to the economy running into the ground, doing nothing to alleviate the suffering of the people. They come up with stopgap measures, but no actual reforms that are needed in order to unlock billions of dollars of aid that billions of dollars of funds that this country needs. It's a country which is dollar hungry because Lebanon imports almost everything. So the dollar, the official rate is 1,500. It now trades on the black market over 38,000, and the black market is what dominates trading. So this is like the overview of what's going on. We can talk more about the Palestinian, Syrian refugees, but this country is collapsing, and there are signs everywhere.
Thank you very much for that initial overview, and I think probably quite justifiably bleak. But Maha, if I could just turn to you, I mean, looking as an analyst as you are, I mean, do you think there's a chance for Lebanon to address some of these underlying issues without something very seismic happening?
Hi, Chris. Thank you for having me today, and thank you all for joining us, Zeina, being on this panel. There's always a chance. The question is there a will? And in Lebanon, I don't see a will in the Bronx political elite. Any kind of reform that is required. I mean, today Lebanon went to the IMF actually even 2 years ago.
You're cracking up a little bit. Is it possible to perhaps get a bit closer to the mic, or?
Is this better?
Yes.
Better now? Okay. What I was saying is that Lebanon there's always a chance. The question is there a will? Lebanon today, I mean, at the economic and financial level, you need a substantial package to be able to get the country out of the mess it's in. We're talking about more than $80 billion. What needs to be done is not rocket science. This is not the first country that has gone through an economic and financial crisis. However, it is the first country where its political elite has consistently refused to address the economic and financial crisis head-on, to undertake the kind of reforms they did. And actually, they have pushed the cost of adjustment in a significant way on its most vulnerable populations. And it's been persistent. What we've seen is the policy of no policy making. It's very insidious. When the World Bank talks about it as a deliberate depression, it is a deliberate depression. Started put out a small article called A 10-Point Plan to Avoid the Lost Decade, which we actually did together with about 20 economists and financial experts from Lebanon and political scientists. Had that plan been implemented, and it was really like a 5-pager, but it wasn't rocket science. What needs to be done is evident, and it's there. The political elite of this country has consisted. Part of it has to do with the fact that any kind of reform will be eating away at what at their prerogatives and at what they've actually acquired within state institutions. Just for everybody to recall, much of the current political elite are the former warlords of Lebanon who took part in its 15 years of a war. So moving to the state settlement did not mean the end of the war. It actually meant a continuation of the war by other means. It meant that state institutions were treated as war bounty or war booty, rather than as something to be rebuilt and reconstructed. So we ended up in a situation where most of the state institutions are run by specific political parties. Meritocracy is nowhere to be seen. And, it's a civil service that's overstaffed, it's rampant corruption, it's overpaying. I mean, these stories, and as a journalist would have covered most of this, these stories have been around for a long time. You pay, I don't know, $10 for a kilometer of just fixing a highway in Lebanon. Elsewhere, you'll pay $100 in Lebanon. So the corruption is quite deep. For the political elite, any kind of reform that is needed, including, for example, canceling institutions that are no longer necessary, where people are just getting money for doing nothing, is out of the question. It means eating up into their clientelist networks. So we are where we are today. The other reason, obviously, is that there is a marriage between the political elite and some of the business elite, including the banking sector. So the paralysis is at a point where nothing moves. The political paralysis is such, and this became a lot more acute after 2008 and the Doha Accords, where there was this attempt to create, or this agreement that moving forward, we would only have national unity governments where all political parties were included in government. The end result was you ended up with complete political paralysis. No decisions can be made. Everybody has the right to veto everyone else. And in fact, in much of the government since 2008, it's been a kind of a vetocracy, where literally everybody vetoes everybody else, and each ministry is a kind of an island in and of itself. This kind of mentality has extended now far beyond government services. I was joking a few days ago with a friend of mine that each building now has become a republic in and of itself, trying to find its own sources of water, its own sources of electricity. People are, doing, there's solar, there's wind turbines. You might think it's great, everybody's going energy efficient. On the one hand, yes, but because there are no state institutions and there is no legislation and no one organizing all this, it's very haphazard. I'll give one example. People today are installing UPSs at home to make sure that they have alternative power sources. Most of these UPSs are acid-based, which means A, they emit cancerous fumes, and B, they need to be replaced in 2 years. We have no idea how these batteries are going, how people are going to get rid of them in 2 years. There's nothing in place. So it's a potential environmental hazard in the making. On top of this, what Zeina described is we have a middle class that's has been decimated. What we have today is a very, the 10% who are already there and who can continue to afford to buy what they want, to do what they want, and then the rest of the population. The government.
You're cracking up again a little bit, Maha. Perhaps you could turn off your video. I think it might help to get the sound a bit better.
The World Bank today is estimating that we have around 60 to 65, 70% poverty rates, depending on where you are in the country. The middle class, the professionals, simply, they've seen their life completely implode. Their savings are gone, their pensions are gone, and their future gains are pretty much not there anymore. Somebody who used to earn, a professor at the American University of Beirut, who used to earn anywhere between $60,000 to $65,000 a year at today's exchange rates in Lebanese lira. At today's exchange rate, this would be the equivalent of maybe $5,000 to $6,000 a year. So just to give you a kind of a sense of the scale of the collapse. The whiplash has been incredible. This is a country which in October 2019 was considered a middle income country. Now it's scraping the bottom of the barrel. So the situation is quite tenuous. On top of this, the institutions we're seeing, the economy is shrunk as much as it can. But at the same time, now we're witnessing the institutional collapse. Institutions are no longer functional. Civil services are not going to their offices. It took me 6 months to get a paper from the Ministry of Finance for me to be able to pay them some taxes that I owed them. 6 months to be able to do that. So just to give a sense of there's a lot of concern around the internal security forces, the army, because they've seen their salaries also completely decimated. We're seeing a lot more security incidents around the country. And it's not just the banks. I mean, the banks are just, as Zeina said, these are not thugs. These are people who desperately need access to their money because many of them have medical cases. Family members who need medical treatment. But above and beyond that, we're seeing a lot more incidents across the country. They're very rampant. Now, does that mean we're moving into a new cycle of violence? I don't think so. I don't think we're looking at a new civil conflict as such, and we can discuss why not. But I think we're looking at a kind of slow disintegration of law and order across the country, which also will have significant repercussions on safety, on well-being, on also stability, social stability in the country and political stability. On top of that, there are other regional factors that are coming into play, whether it's what happens with the JCPOA and what kind of impact that will have on Lebanon. We can talk about this in the Q&A if people are interested. Syria and what happens, what kind of political settlement happens in Syria. That also will have significant impact on Lebanon, but also the Palestinian the situation, the Palestinian conflict, Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Lebanon has become we're seeing many more of the former Palestinian or current Palestinian leadership moving to Lebanon. There are quite a few moves in that direction. So things, whatever happens in Jerusalem or in different parts of, whether it's in the West Bank or in Gaza, this has also the potential to impact Lebanon. And again, we can also talk about this in the Q&A. Plus the regional tensions, of course, between Iran and the rest of the region. There is an ongoing dialogue with the Saudis. Where that dialogue ends also has the potential to impact Lebanon in one way or the other. Again, I'm just throwing these out ideas, but we can, if people are interested, we can talk about it.
Thank you very much, Maha. That's you've covered a lot of ground there. I just wondered if I could come back to you, Zeina. Maha there was suggesting she didn't see that the situation would descend into further violence. Yet, we saw these protests, back in 2019 and etc. COVID is now, if not, it's certainly not over, but it's certainly not so much of an issue. Do you think that there's a chance for protests in the future, or have people really given up on changing the system?
I think, well, from the start, we could never say that the majority of people were on the streets. I disagree with those who say that, because you still had a significant portion of the population following or continuing to support the mainly sectarian political parties, either for ideological reasons or because they simply benefited from those parties. And also because many people used to tell us in the street that we were not presented with an alternative. We do not know what the alternative is. And sectarian differences are quite deep in this country. I'll just give you, I'll just put it the way it is. You're in the street, you tell a Shia, for example, we want Hezbollah disarmed. Oh, then, you're coming after our community. Or you talk to a Christian about the possibility of an electoral law being a single constituency, they get scared, they're a minority. Oh no, we won't get any MPs in parliament. So the divisions are deep. It's not very easy to unite this country. Yes, they were holding that Lebanese flag for months, but the optics are all wrong. At least this is what I can say after years of reporting and understanding how people think. The loyalty is to the sect first in this country. Yes, of course, there are people who are loyal to Lebanon. Of course, people who, they want hope that things can change, but this is just a minority. When you have political parties who have supporters who are ready to beat up people in the street, not necessarily the security forces, but people or thugs belonging to a certain political party, you cannot change. Change will not come from the street. You just don't have that numbers. You don't have the numbers. Yes, security disturbances, Lebanon. I mean, I lived here during the Civil War, and I did not feel as insecure as I feel today. So you always have to look over your shoulder. You always, especially, even when you take a cab, you don't know if he's just going to pull out a gun and demand money. You get this sense of, security breakdown, the civil conflict, all out war. It's not in the interest of the parties for the time being. Plus, you also have the issue of a balance of power. So no, I agree. We're not seeing a civil conflict. I don't think change will come from the street. It's going to take time. It's going to take a long time for that to happen. Yeah, I don't know if Maha will agree with me, but I mean, we spent months in the street. You just didn't feel the unity was not there.
Thank you. I'm going to throw that back to Maha, but also just to ask, because you touched on it at the end, so I'm going to actually tease a little bit about the regional alliances and make up its impact on Lebanon. You mentioned the JCPOA, the possibility of a deal, or even perhaps the absence of such a deal. I mean, is there any chance that we could see, some sort of regional action to try to calm things and heal things in Lebanon?
Thanks, Chris. I'll come back to your question in a second, but just to build on what Zeina was saying. Most communities in Lebanon today present themselves as victims. There is a broader culture of victimization across the country, and it depends on where you are on the spectrum. So there is this kind of fear-mongering that is also encouraged and perpetuated by the political leadership to a large extent. However, what we saw in 2019 is a kind of pushback against this narrative. It's not yet strong enough, and I think the results of the parliamentary elections point in that direction. People are fed up with this sectarian discourse. They do want to have, many would like to see a country that is based on a civic understanding of the nation, if you want, or civic identity, rather than sectarian identity, and would like to push in that direction. Is the support overwhelming? Of course not. Is there sufficient support? I think it needs time, like any country in the world where there is political change on top of an economic and financial collapse in a region that is significantly polarized. This takes time. Change anywhere takes time. Are we seeing some leadership emerge at the local level? And I think this is where the hope is. Yes, we are. And we saw. They're young, they're beginning to build themselves up, but this takes time. We went from people, if you recall, in 2015, we had the You Stink movement, which were very much about development issues and the garbage collection, to 2019, where it was bringing down the regime and wanting to change the regime. But we went from people saying, we don't believe in hierarchical relationships, we don't want political parties, politics is a dirty word, to now a lot of discussion about how do we go about establishing political parties, a recognition that if we want to change the system, we need to be involved in a formal political game, which includes new political parties. It includes I think somebody needs to mute their mic.
If you could.
Okay. So it means new political parties, etc. So just to say that it's bleak, but it's not hopeless. However, change takes time. And unfortunately in Lebanon, the time needed for political change and the time needed to address economic collapse go in opposing direction. We need a lot more time for change, whereas the economic collapse, just to stem the economic, financial, and institutional collapse, which also is changing the very identity of the country, is much more truncated. Things need to be done much faster. On the issue of the JCPOA, as you know, I mean, I'm not holding my breath on the JCPOA. I think the chances of getting some sort of a deal are pretty slim right now. there is still conversations. I mean, the Europeans are still pushing for some conversations, but I'm not seeing a breakthrough at this particular point in time. Will there be a regional attempt to calm things down in Lebanon? There could be, and that could happen. And if the JCPOA happens, it will have its own set of repercussions on Lebanon. On the one hand, it probably would calm Hezbollah. On the other hand, it also gives them a financial influx. I mean, there are different things one can see happening when it comes to Lebanon versus the JCPOA. But even if it doesn't happen, there is a discussion ongoing between the Saudis and the Iranians. This discussion is happening in Oman, but also in Baghdad. At this point, I think a JCPOA will probably also help this discussion to continue and reach some sort of a fruition. But my sense is there is an understanding in the region, and I've heard this repeatedly from different interlocutors, that this is our region, we need to figure out a way to live with each other. And I've heard this from the Saudis, but also from Iranians and others. This sense that we have to figure out a way to calm things down. There is a move to try and stabilize, if you like, and I put this in between quotes, because I think the ways that stabilization is being approached is very much of a top-down. It's one that keeps the current systems in place, which means, particularly when it comes to Syria, which to my mind means that we will continue to have a lot of instability in this region for a very long time to come. So a regional initiative could possibly happen. It will have to include the Saudis and the Iranians, but we have to wait and see how that's going to play out. Now, the immediate implications of these kinds of agreements is that, on the one hand, it's very likely that we have presidential elections coming up. It's very likely that these elections will not happen in time. It's becoming highly unlikely that we will see a new president for Lebanon before November 1st, which is the deadline. October 31st, there should be a new president in place. So we may likely be moving into a vacuum at the presidential level, which means if that's going to happen, it's likely that the current government will get a new lease on life with some shuffling. This is the news we're hearing right now. Somebody asked about the maritime border deal. It looked like, as of this morning, it looked like the maritime border deal was on track. There is an urgency to try and get it in place before November 1st and the Israeli elections, because should Netanyahu win, as many of the polls are projecting, then he has already said he will reject that deal. So there is an eagerness to try and get that in place before Israeli elections. However, the chief Israeli negotiator just resigned because he doesn't like the deal. So it's not clear where things are going on that front.
Thank you very much, Maha, and answering that first question as well. So Neil, did you have any, Neil Patrick, you were asking about that. Did you have any follow-up question to that?
Yes, please. Can you hear me, Chris?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I would just like to keep the focus on Lebanon in terms of the maritime deal. Obviously, we're all very aware of the constraints and politicking on the Israeli side, but on the Lebanese side, does Maha or Zeina believe that it is actually plausible, given the tensions within Lebanon, given the competing national and sovereign claims, it's plausible within Lebanon by the end of this month, or indeed during the interim, or even after a new president comes into play and a new so-called permanent government is eventually formed? Is it plausible that a deal can hold from Lebanon's point of view? There are arguments that it would be a massive compromise of Lebanese sovereignty, or at the very least, money would have to be given to Israel to compensate them, it seems, under the terms of this deal, for the arrangements over Qana. Can this actually hold? And indeed, related to that, would any Lebanese government need some kind of security guarantees, or at least cooperation from the United States or from others, so that its sovereignty would not be affected by possible Israeli attacks around those gas facilities? And indeed, Israel, would it require some kind of arrangements as well, that it isn't under any attack from Hezbollah, as has been threatened on occasion? So there's a number of parameters here, but I'd like to keep the focus on the Lebanese side, please.
Who'd like to go first? Perhaps Maha?
I think that On the Lebanese side, the possibility of a deal going through, if it has Hezbollah's blessing, are quite high. My understanding is that Hezbollah is fully cognizant of the terms of the deal, and they do want to see the deal in place. In terms of security guarantees, I'm sure these are already written into the deal. I mean, the Americans are the ones negotiating between the Israelis and the Lebanese. The UN has almost been sidelined in all of this, even though it was the one that was taking the lead on this. So implicit within this, there's going to be de facto some sort of security guarantees, I assume. But just in short, yes, this will not go through unless it has Hezbollah's blessing.
Zeina, did you have anything to add on that? You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Yes, I totally agree with Maha. I mean, Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah said that on Saturday, a few weeks before. I can't remember the exact date. He even called it a historic opportunity that should not be missed, and that they would support the position of the Lebanese leadership, which of course, the Lebanese leadership would not take a position unless it has the backing of Hezbollah. So, and in fact, the president is meeting the caretaker prime minister and the House Speaker as we meet right now, and Lebanon is supposed to give its final position in the coming hour or so. We're expecting it to be a yes, we are on board. Lebanon sees that, it can benefit from this. I mean, we've heard both Nasrallah, even the Speaker of Parliament during the last session, he hinted as if they're not in agreement with any IMF deal, because this is seen as the only way out for Lebanon's crisis. We both heard Nasrallah say, what's the IMF deal? It's just $3 billion when we have billions of dollars under the sea. And then we heard Burri snap at the caretaker prime minister and say something like the IMF does not dictate. I can't remember the exact words he used, but basically what he was saying is the IMF does not dictate anything to us. So I think this is the way they're seeing a way out of the crisis, even though it's not the way out of the crisis. And this is what Maha was saying before. There is no political will to carry out any reforms that will, in one way or the other, lose their hold over the state, make the state stronger than them, because right now it is political parties and politicians who are stronger than the state.
Thank you. We now have actually a batch of questions about the issue of refugees and indeed people leaving by boat. So the first one is from Ali. Ali, are you with us?
I am, yes, thank you. Yeah, it was just a question about how people are able to afford travel at the moment, whether it's by dangerous boat journeys or through other means when banks are still holding on to people's deposits. So the question is, how do they raise the money if they're not able to access their savings? And if they are able to access their savings, is that because there's been a shift in banking policy? Thank you.
Zeina, perhaps we'll start with you.
It's a good question, because this is not cheap. I mean, it costs thousands of dollars to get on that boat, and especially in the past, we used to see young men make the journey. Now it's whole families. And we visited a few families, and either families of survivors or people who have lost loved ones at sea. They sell everything they have. They just sell everything they have in order to get on that boat. Some of them had money put on the side. They sell their jewelry. And some of them have relatives abroad who send them money to be able to pay for this journey, because for them, that's it. They're going to sell everything and make their way to Europe, whether they reach or not, So that's the way. No, there's no special, exemptions made by banks to hand over people's money. In fact, the Depositors Union just an hour ago said that expect more attacks on banks tomorrow in the Mount Lebanon and the Bekaa governorates. That statement was just released an hour ago. So we could maybe possibly see more, I don't know, I wouldn't say violence, but something will happen as more pressure is put on banks.
Maha, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with Zeina. Actually, there was a bank holdup just this morning where, in Har Tahrik, somebody went in and also asked, got their money out of the bank, basically their own deposits. I think we will see a lot more on this, because the more there is a currency collapse. It's just getting worse and worse. The government, on top of that, just passed a budget which, rather than unify the exchange rate, it just added one more exchange rate. They changed the official exchange rate only for customs from 1,500 to 15,000, which means that everything that is imported, and Lebanon imports practically everything, has just become a lot more expensive. So I think the deeper the crisis gets, the worse it's going to become. And people are losing hope after 2.5 years. It's almost 3 years actually now. October, actually in this month, it'll be 3 years since the crisis started. And they see there's no light at the end of the tunnel. They don't see a vision to get the country out of the mess it's in, no policies, no complete political paralysis. So people are getting desperate, and those who've left who can leave have left, and those who are unable to leave are getting more and more desperate to get access to their funds. In terms of people leaving, I agree with Zeina. They practically sell everything in order to just get out and get on a boat. There's another question also about how people are surviving. I mean, the remittances that Zeina mentioned, Lebanon has a large expatriate community across the globe. And the remittances, we're looking at $5 to $6 billion of remittances every year. Rather than going, before they were about 7 to 8, now they're 5 to 6 billion according to the central bank. But much of these remittances are now coming either through OMT, or they're coming through just cash and cash by hand. The country's it's become a cash economy first and foremost. So that's another way people are surviving.
Thank you. We've got a question from Steve Khayat. Steve, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Steve, please ask your question.
Well, thank you for your time today. Well, as I said in my question, actually, the Syrian refugee crisis has been extending for 11 years. We have the highest per capita refugee across the world, especially in the region with regards to the Syrian crisis. It is impossible for us to sustain any recovery with the presence of the refugees. Now, these refugees are their presence in Lebanon is fully correlated with support from the UNHCR and other donating countries, including the European Union. Is there any serious international lobbying or effort towards the direction of such funding towards their return to Syria? Especially that we've noticed that in the last Syrian elections, the Syrian refugees just took buses, went to their embassies and voted and came back. For Bashar al-Assad, and as well some refugees chose to travel across the border to Syria, vote and come back. So the status of refugees no longer holds, and we can see that the international community is actually an accomplice to our demise by keeping them in place in Lebanon. And we don't even have a fifth of the resources Jordan, for example, has. And Jordan has almost just under 1.5 million, where actually our numbers have exceeded 2 million in Lebanon. So I would like to hear from the speakers and yourself, perhaps, if there's any serious attempt, because the local authorities have not shown any unity with regards to this file, and it's actually exacerbating our demise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Maha, you've written about this, the issue of, return of Syrian refugees. How would you answer, Steve?
I look at it a bit differently. We did a study in 2017, 2018. It was called Unheard Voices: What Syrian Refugees Need to Go Back Home. Anybody who's interested, it's on our website. This wasn't a paid advertisement or unpaid advertisement, but just to say that this is there was serious work that was done, and many others have done behind it. It was based on focus group discussions with refugees in Lebanon and Jordan. Two things stand out from this work, and they continue to be valid, unfortunately, to today. One is people are desperate to go back home. They would much rather be in their homes back in Syria than they would rather than to be in Lebanon. However, they are unable to go home. They're unable to go home for a number of reasons. One is that the Syrian regime currently does not want them to go home. The majority of refugees in Lebanon and in Jordan come from areas that were key sites of opposition to the regime. For example, I think if memory serves me, around 18 to 20% of refugees in Lebanon came from Homs, many from Baba Amr, which no longer exists. The whole area has just been completely demolished, and so on and so forth. So the majority of refugees literally come from areas where either their homes are no longer standing, or they come from areas that, or these same areas are considered by the regime as hotbeds of opposition, and therefore they're all persona non grata. The narrative was that these are enemies of the regime, if you like. So it's very hard for these people to go back, but that's not the only part of the story. The other part is that in order to be able to go back, there are security checks and balance checks that are in place. So for any refugee that wants to go back officially, they need to be vetted by the Syrian security services. Again, if memory serves me, I think 2 or 3 years ago, around 4,000 refugees applied to go back via UNHCR. UNHCR was facilitating this within Lebanese internal security forces. The Syrian security forces accepted maybe about 300 or 400. I don't have exact numbers, but more or less this was kind of the scale. So they do not want people to go back. There are other measures in place also to prevent people from going back. This includes the law number 10, which is about the expropriation of property of Syrian refugees under the pretext of reconstruction. There are laws that are about mandatory military conscription for anybody between the age, I think if memory serves me again, between the age of 18, and they raised it up to, can't remember, 45 or 50. So any male who goes back is forced back into the army. Many of the young men I met at the time talked about, if we go back, we're just going to be forced to be at the forefront of any battles. And we have no training. We're just going to be thrown to the wolves, literally. There's very little security. Even if they get the security clearances to go back, many of those who go back end up facing a lot of problems there. So, and this is the tip of the iceberg. There are lots of other issues. So the issue is not that, it's not about UNHCR wanting to keep the refugees in Lebanon or in Jordan for that matter, or anywhere else for that matter. It's not a conspiracy by the international community. However, I believe the international community has become somewhat complacent because the refugee, and again, going back to the numbers, I think there is an exaggeration in the numbers. If you look at UNHCR figures, they talk about 850,000. Sorry?
Correct, 850,000.
So they talk about 850,000 Syrian refugees. So there is an overinflation of the numbers in the public discourse. However, where the complacency is coming in is that, okay, so they're here. This is a country that's completely collapsing. Many of these refugees live in the poorest areas in Lebanon, again, because there was no central policy to deal with the refugee crisis. It was literally pushed to the local level, and mayors had to decide whether they would accept refugees or not, and with no financial support, etc. So what the UN is doing now, and other international agencies, is they're trying to they're still supporting refugees, but they're also, for the last few years, there's been a consistent effort to support host communities. Is this enough? No, it's not enough. Do we need do we need collectively to start thinking outside the box in terms of how do you support a refugee population in a country that's completely collapsing, and a host community population that is also living the effects of total financial, economic, and institutional collapse? There needs to be some creative thinking, and I think this is where the international community has become incredibly complacent. There isn't enough discussion around this, or attempt to see what can be done on this front, whether for Lebanon or for Jordan.
Thank you, Maha. Zeina, anything to add?
I mean, I think Maha said it all, but I mean, the status of refugees still holds. I disagree that this doesn't hold because, yes, there are a lot of Syrians in Lebanon. Some are refugees who escaped war, who cannot return for a variety of reasons that Maha mentioned. And you also have the economic migrants. Many people here, they come here to try to find work because 90% of the people of Syria are now poor. I mean, the economic crisis is dire in Syria as well. So I think that we have to make a difference between these two. You go up to Arcel, you have people who come from the town of Khodr. It's a town within the Homs governorate. These people cannot go back at all. They took part in opposition activities, or the whole area has become a military base. So, and to say that Lebanon, to blame refugees for Lebanon's economic collapse, there's no doubt that their presence had added strain on the infrastructure and on schools, but they did not cause this crisis. It's mismanagement and corruption, decades of that by the ruling or the political class, which is now blaming them for this collapse.
Thank you. And I would very much echo the point about the complacency of the international community. I think that they are now ignoring both the situation in Syria. I'm not sure what a British government policy is on Syria right now, let alone Lebanon. And of course, we're looking at many European states, Britain included, of course, that has zero intention of taking in any more refugees themselves. So I think that serious questions for us here in Europe, including Britain, have to be answered. William Bell, just while we're on the refugees, you had a question, William?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, thanks, Chris. In many ways, Maha answered it, but I think it's just digging maybe a little bit deeper into what the expectations of the international community can be in the current situation, because obviously the situation is hugely onerous. Whoever's the responsibility, and I take Zeina's point just now in terms of the refugees and what impact it's had on Lebanon. But if you just, for example, take the situation of Shatila refugee camp, which was, as many people on this call will know, built for approximately 3,000 people in 1949 and is now host to in the region of 22,000 people, obviously added to significantly since the civil war in Syria. That situation can't be sustained forever. It seems to be the sort of the hope of the international community that they'll never actually have to deal with this problem in a serious way. But anybody who visited Shatila or Ain al-Helwi or any of the other Palestinian refugee camps will know that many of them are literally a breaking point, with law and order breaking down and the humanitarian situation dire. So it's only a matter of time before we have repeats of what we've seen in camps such as Nahal Bared and others across the country. So I wonder what Palestinian refugees and of course Syrian refugees can expect from the international community that will change this dynamic or address it at least.
Does either speaker believe that the international community is prepared, willing, able to do anything to change that dynamic?
If I can just mention, I mean, look at the UNHCR, the UN, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, the only sole agency that helps the refugees in Lebanon. They just don't have the money. They keep on holding, press conferences, calling on donors. Do not forget the Palestinians. They've had to slash the cash assistance they give to Syrian Palestinians because a lot of Syrian Palestinians moved to Lebanon during the war. This situation is dire. More than 50 Palestinians were on that migrant boat trying to reach Europe when it capsized off the coast of Tartus. People are desperate. And it's not just that. Palestinians in Lebanon are barred from working in many professions. They don't even get basic rights, no rights to healthcare. So they only rely on UNRWA, which is cash strapped, and it has been begging for money. So that's just for the Palestinian refugees. What more for the Syrian refugees, who I think their number is much higher than the Palestinians in Lebanon.
Thank you very much, and for the question, William.
Can I add something just on that,
yeah.
Chris?
Of course.
I completely agree with what Zeina said. Just to say two things: is it's not just that there is no willingness on the part of the international community to deal particularly with the Palestinian issue, but actually we've seen them defunding. There's been a trend of defunding UNRWA, which is incredibly dangerous, because for the Palestinian community in particular, UNRWA is the only source of funding that they have for their health and for their education. So defunding UNRWA means defunding schools, defunding primary healthcare systems, etc. Especially in a country like Lebanon, where, as Zeina said, they have no other civic rights. So I think, again, there's more and more kind of complacency and a lack of, frankly, responsibility towards one of the longest serving refugee populations in the world. And this is all because ultimately the solution to all these issues is a proper political settlement, whether it's around Syria or whether it's the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And unfortunately, I don't see either of them anywhere near happening anywhere in the near future. I think the two-state solution is now off the table, even though they don't say it as such. It's become moot to some extent, and in Syria, I don't see any political settlement of any sort that manages to kind of put the country back on its feet again.
Having just come back from Palestine myself, I can reaffirm that sense as well. No sign of a solution on the horizon. We've got one question from Mohammed Amin, which I think touches on a slightly different topic, which we've referred to, I suppose. Mohammed, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes.
Both the speakers have talked about the failure of the political elites and the clientelism, etc. But I have the slightly harsh view that I think it was Winston Churchill once said, a country gets the government that it deserves. And to what extent do the Lebanese people see themselves primarily as members of religious groups, as opposed to Lebanese citizens? And is anything going to change until the Lebanese people themselves change the way they think about their identity and what is important to them?
Right. Should we go to Zeina first this time? And perhaps if you have any concluding comments, because it's the last 5 minutes of,
yes,
of the event.
I'll just give you an example. The other day I was somewhere and I asked somebody, do you know anybody in the municipality? Because it's the state institutions, they're not working. Oh, yeah, I know this guy. I said, but weren't you with the, the civil society and calling for revolution? Yeah, but what are we supposed to do? If we're not good with these people, then we can't get what we need. We can't get anything done. We will be, the political parties, the mainly sectarian political parties control state institutions. You as a citizen you need to be loyal to them, not to the state, to be able to get any services. So at the end, that young boy who was in the street protesting for change had to talk to a member of a political party to get something done in the municipality. So this is one of the reasons, because you have no choice. People don't have a choice. But at the end of the day, there's also ideological reasons why people stick to these political parties. Maybe Maha is more optimistic than me. She thinks that this is the beginning and there will be change. Maybe it's so much what I hear in the street and the hatred, us, them. I keep hearing this, and leaders play on this. And I don't know how long it will take, if people will ever change and stop being suspicious of each other. Say, if they are in power, then they may kill us. I hear it a lot. I hear it on the street. This is what people know. This is what they understand. But no, I'm not as optimistic as you, Maha. I'm sorry.
No, fair enough, Zeina. But I honestly, I think that my optimism is not. There's a part of it which is optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect, as Gramsci used to say. But that's a different story. No, my optimism is based on observation, honestly, and of talking to people. I do see a sizable, I would say, population that is, and I saw this especially since 2019, but also in the run-up to the elections, a sizable population that is genuinely looking for a different kind of Lebanon, that is genuinely looking to put together a different kind of identity politics in Lebanon. They are still a minority, but the kind of support that they've gotten from broader communities. I look, for example, at the lists in the South that came out during the elections. They didn't win. They won 2 seats, actually, but nevertheless, there seems to be an interest in a different kind of identity politics and a different kind of politics in Lebanon. But this is all very short term. It is not a long-term prospect. It will take time. Can you still hear me?
We can.
Okay, this is because my electricity just went off. Welcome to Lebanon. So this is a long-term prospect. It will take time and it will take effort. People are already now talking about getting ready for the municipal elections, which are supposed to happen in 1 year. I'm not certain they will, given especially as the likelihood of the postponement of a presidential election are very much on the cards. So then you have people already preparing for the next parliamentary election. We're seeing a different kind of politics play out. So, but in response also to the question about whether people identify themselves as Lebanese or as members of the sectarian community, I think people have multiple identities, in all honesty, and it depends on where they are and what you're talking to them about. It's either a woman or a youth or a doctor. It really is about different layers of identity. Sectarian identity, especially in the context of collapse, does come out a lot more, particularly as we are likely to see, and we're already seeing, for example, the protection racket increase as state security institutions collapse. We're seeing more and more people turning towards their local neighborhood thugs, if you want, or militias for protection. Many of these political groups are the ones that have the financial means to provide support, whether it's in health or in education or in food, access to food. We didn't talk about the impact of, the food crisis that the Lebanon is facing. So in a context like this, people will turn to what is familiar and what is accessible because they want to survive. So I think we have two dynamics playing off each other. And as I said, unfortunately, they're at loggerheads. Chris, if you'll allow me to say 2 things about the financial audit questions that came up. One is about the financial audit. I think it's very unlikely for that to happen, and it is a precondition. That's why the political leadership is very keen to find any other option but the IMF. However, the IMF is not just about the IMF. It's also about unlocking support from many other donor countries, whether it's the French, whether it's the Gulf countries, etc. So that's one set of issues. The other, Brigitte asked about the responsibility of the international community towards host the Lebanese. There's a lot of humanitarian support coming in, Brigitte. Can the country use more? Yes, and actually this humanitarian support has played an important role in helping the Lebanese survive. In the aftermath of the August 4th explosion, it was people-to-people support, whether it was the Lebanese private sector or if it was international organizations. However, I think international organizations also need to rethink their modus operandi. The World Bank just came out with a report talking about how the complicity of some of the international organizations, including the World Bank, I would say, in their checks and balances when they dealt with the Lebanese government, actually allowed millions and millions of dollars to be siphoned off. So I think there is a responsibility there in terms of rethinking development models and how the international community and the United Nations work with countries or states like the Lebanese state and its political leadership.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry if we didn't get everybody's questions in, and also for the somewhat shaky sound at 1 or 2 points there, but I think that is really an indication of some of the challenges of calling Lebanon and Maha's power and everything else. But a huge thank you to our speakers. I think that we've covered a lot of ground and they did brilliantly, both Zeina and Maha, so thank you very much to that. And just to remind everybody that we have another event coming on tomorrow with Diana Dark, who will be speaking about The Cultural Legacy of the Ottomans. It's a terrific book that she's come out with, and really busts, I think, a lot of myths about the way in which the Ottoman Empire is perceived here in the West. So I urge you to sign up to that. That's at 6 o'clock. Joe kindly put everything in the link. So it just remains for me to thank you all for attending, your questions, and to our speakers.